He kissed me in front of everyone, not the cold, dutiful kiss of our wedding, but something fierce and possessive that made the Duchess of Ashford gasp, and Lady Beatrice turn white with rage. 60 seconds earlier, I had been exposed as the purchased bride, the desperate daughter whose father's £50,000 debt had bought the Duke a suitable wife. Now, breathless and trembling in my husband's arms, I had no idea if this was rescue or ruin. If you're ready to enjoy this story, click that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more wonderful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. London, May 1852. The late afternoon sunlight slanted through the high windows of the humble Cartwright townhouse, failing to warm the room where Amelia sat. She traced the elegant script of the marriage settlement before her, the parchment feeling cold and heavy under her fingertips. Her heart was a silent drum against the oppressive atmosphere of her father's library. "You have accepted the terms, Miss Cartwright?" The solicitor's voice, dry and weary, confirmed the reality she was facing. Amelia Cartwright, wearing a simple gown that emphasized her slender grace, like the royal blue in the image, lifted her chin. Her eyes, usually soft, now reflected a fierce, brittle resolve. At 26, she had long held on to the foolish hope of marrying for affection. Now she understood the brutal value of duty. "I do, Mr. Holloway," she replied, her voice steady. "The terms are agreeable." Her father, Lord Cartwright, sat slumped in his chair, unable to meet her gaze, the shadow of his recent financial ruin darkening the room. The desperation was absolute. The estate was forfeit, and her younger sister's future depended entirely on this one transaction. The library door opened silently, and the air seemed to crystallize. Julian Whitmore, the Duke of Whitmore, entered, a man whose reserve was as legendary as his wealth. He was tall, impeccably tailored, and moved with a cool, aristocratic certainty. His features, handsome but sharp, held no trace of warmth. The solicitor stumbled to his feet, acknowledging the Duke with deference. Julian ignored the solicitor, his cool grey gaze settling directly on Amelia. "Miss Cartwright." His voice was low, controlled, and delivered with the crisp precision of a final command. "I trust you are ready to conclude this business." Business. Amelia felt the word like a sharp blow. She stood, determined to face her future without flinching. "I am, Your Grace." Julian approached the desk, the pen already in hand. He signed his bold, confident name first, the ink declaring his ownership over the terms. When he extended the pen across the mahogany for her signature, their fingers brushed briefly, a fleeting physical contact that was as cold and impersonal as the paper they were about to bind themselves to. The ink had barely dried when Julian dismissed the solicitor with a single, imperious gesture. Mr. Holloway gathered his papers with practiced haste, bowing his way out of the library. Lord Cartwright, perhaps sensing that his presence was equally unwelcome, muttered something about arrangements and fled the room, leaving Amelia alone with the man who now held her future in his hands. The silence stretched between them, taut and suffocating. Julian stood by the window, his profile sharp against the fading light, his hands clasped behind his back with military precision. Amelia remained seated, her fingers still resting on the contract she had just signed. She refused to fidget, refused to look away, though every instinct screamed at her to escape the weight of his scrutiny. "We will be married in 3 weeks' time," Julian said at last, his tone as measured as if he were discussing the weather. "The ceremony will be held at St. George's, Hanover Square. It will be suitably grand to satisfy the expectations of the ton, but brief. I have no patience for theatrical displays of sentiment. Emilia inclined her head. As you wish, Your Grace. He turned then, his grey eyes settling on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. I must be clear about the nature of this arrangement, Miss Cartwright. You will bear my name and my title. You will be the Duchess of Whittemore in every public respect. You will manage my household with competence and grace, and you will, in time, provide an heir to secure the ducal line. Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples she could not yet comprehend. Emilia forced herself to hold his gaze. I understand my duties, Your Grace. Do you? There was no mockery in his question, only a clinical assessment. He moved closer, and she became acutely aware of his height, the breadth of his shoulders, the controlled power in every line of his body. This is not a love match, Miss Cartwright. I will not insult your intelligence by pretending otherwise. You are here because your family needs due my financial intervention. I am here because I require a duchess of suitable breeding and comportment. That is the entirety of our transaction. The bluntness should have humiliated her. Perhaps it would have, if she had not already spent the past month reconciling herself to this exact reality. Instead, she felt a strange, cold clarity settle over her. I have no illusions about the nature of our arrangement, Your Grace. You have purchased my compliance and my name. I will honor the bargain. Something flickered in his expression, surprise, perhaps, or the faintest hint of approval. You will find me a fair master of this arrangement, Miss Cartwright, provided you adhere to one absolute condition, and that is discretion. The word was iron. The precise financial terms of our agreement, the sum paid to settle your father's debts, the provisions made for your sister's dowry. These details remain strictly between us, the solicitor, and your father. Society will believe this to be an advantageous match for both parties. They will assume affection, or at least mutual respect. They must never know the truth of the transaction. Emilia felt the familiar burn of shame in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. You fear they would think less of you for purchasing a bride, Your Grace. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. I fear they would think less of you, Miss Cartwright, and by extension, less of the Whittemore name. A duchess subjected to pity or scorn is of no use to me. The answer surprised her. She had expected vanity, pride, perhaps a concern for his own reputation. She had not expected him to consider hers, even if only as a matter of practical utility. You need not concern yourself with my discretion, Emilia said quietly. I have no desire to be pitied. Good. Julian stepped back, the momentary intensity dissipating as quickly as it had appeared. You will move into Whittemore House in London following the wedding. We will remain in town for the remainder of the season to establish your presence in society and then retire to Whittemore Abbey in the country. You will have your own apartments, your own staff, and complete autonomy over the domestic arrangements of both residences. Separate apartments, Emilia repeated. Understanding the implication, yes, his tone brooked no negotiation. I will visit you when necessary to fulfill the obligation of producing an heir. Beyond that, we will maintain the appearance of a cordial but independent union. I have no intention of playing the devoted husband, Miss Cartwright, and I do not require you to play the adoring wife. We need only maintain the illusion for the benefit of society. Emilia should have felt relief. Instead, a hollow ache settled somewhere beneath her ribs, not for the loss of love, for she had already mourned that, but for the starkness of the future he described. A life of pretense, of formality, of careful distance, a gilded cage with separate wings. Is there anything else, Your Grace? She asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Julian studied her for a long moment, and for the first time she thought she detected something other than cold assessment in his gaze. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faintest trace of respect. "I expected tears," he said abruptly, "or at least protestations, some display of wounded sentiment." Amelia rose from her chair, meeting his eyes with as much dignity as she could summon. "Would tears change the terms of our arrangement, Your Grace?" "No. Then they would be wasted, would they not?" The silence that followed was different from the ones before, less oppressive, more considering. Julian's expression remained impassive, but something shifted in the set of his shoulders, the slight inclination of his head. "Indeed," he said at last. "Wasted entirely." He moved toward the door, then paused, glancing back at her. "You may be more suited to this role than I anticipated, Miss Cartwright." It was not a compliment, not exactly, but it was not contempt either. Amelia watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, and felt the weight of her new reality settle around her like a heavy cloak. She had signed away her heart, her future, her hope of being loved. In return, she had gained a title, security for her family, and the clinical respect of a man who saw her as a useful acquisition. She told herself it was enough. It had to be. The wedding was everything society demanded, and nothing Amelia had ever dreamed of. St. George's, Hanover Square, was filled to capacity with the cream of London's aristocracy, all eager to witness the union of the Duke of Whittemore and the suddenly fortunate Miss Cartwright. The flowers were exquisite, the music flawless, and Amelia's gown, a creation of white silk and Brussels lace that had cost more than her family's townhouse, transformed her into a vision of bridal perfection. Julian stood beside her at the altar, impeccably dressed, his expression one of composed formality. When he spoke his vows, his voice was clear and steady, carrying no hint of emotion beyond dutiful compliance. Amelia matched his tone precisely, her own words crisp and controlled. When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian lifted her veil with the mechanical precision of a man completing a necessary task, and pressed a brief, cold kiss to her lips. It was over in an instant, leaving no trace of warmth. The breakfast that followed was a triumph of social theatre. Amelia smiled at the appropriate moments, accepted congratulations with gracious modesty, and played the role of blushing bride with such skill that even the most suspicious dowagers seemed satisfied. Julian remained at her side, attentive in public, his hand occasionally resting at the small of her back with the perfect degree of husbandly propriety. To the watching world, they were the picture of a successful match, beauty, wealth, and breeding united in harmonious alliance. Only Amelia knew the truth of the ice beneath the performance. The journey to Whitmore Abbey took them away from London and into the rolling countryside of Wiltshire. The estate, when it finally came into view, took Amelia's breath away despite herself. The great house rose against the summer sky, all golden stone and elegant proportions, surrounded by manicured gardens and ancient parkland that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was beautiful, magnificent even, and it felt as cold and unwelcoming as a mausoleum. Julian handed her down from the carriage himself, the gesture courteous but impersonal. "Mrs. Dawson will show you to your apartments," he said. "I trust you will find them adequate. If you require anything, you need only inform the housekeeper." "Thank you, Your Grace," Amelia replied, the formal address feeling strange and bitter on her tongue. She was his wife, and yet she could no more call him by his Christian name than she could embrace him in public. He inclined his head. "I have business to attend to in the estate office. We will dine at 8. Please feel free to familiarize yourself with the house and grounds." And with that, he was gone, disappearing into the depths of his ancestral home, leaving Amelia standing alone in the grand entrance hall with only the servants for company. The apartments he had assigned her were, indeed, more than adequate. They were luxurious, a suite of rooms decorated in shades of cream and pale gold, with tall windows overlooking the rose garden and furnishings that spoke of generations of wealth and taste. Her dressing room alone was larger than the bedroom she had shared with her sister in the Cartwright townhouse. But the rooms were also isolated, separated from the Duke's own chambers by an entire corridor and a locked connecting door that remained resolutely closed. The first weeks established a pattern that would define their marriage. Amelia rose early and took breakfast in her sitting room. She spent her mornings consulting with Mrs. Dawson about household management, reviewing menus, inspecting linens, and attending to the 1,000 small details that kept a great estate running smoothly. The servants, initially cautious of their new mistress, soon learned that the Duchess was both knowledgeable and fair. She never raised her voice, never made unreasonable demands, and remembered each of their names and circumstances with genuine care. In the afternoons, she walked the gardens, read in the magnificent library, or wrote letters to her sister. She played the pianoforte in the music room, her fingers finding solace in Beethoven and Mozart when her heart could find none elsewhere. She embroidered, she sketched, she filled the empty hours with purposeful activity, determined not to sink into melancholy. Julian was a ghost in his own house. She saw him at dinner each evening, where they sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to seat 20, making polite conversation about nothing of consequence: the weather, the state of the harvest, the latest letter from his man of business. He asked after her comfort, and she assured him that all was well. She inquired about his day, and he offered vague responses about estate matters and correspondence. They were exquisitely civil to one another, and the politeness was suffocating. He never visited her apartments. The marriage remained unconsummated, the obligation of producing an heir apparently not yet urgent enough to require his attention. Amelia told herself she was relieved. The thought of that cold, clinical intimacy filled her with a dread she could not name. Sometimes she caught him watching her, a fleeting glance across the dinner table, a moment of observation when she entered the drawing room. Once, she had looked up from her book in the library to find him standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. He had nodded curtly and walked away without a word, leaving her staring after him in confusion. The silence between them was not hostile. It was simply vast, an unbridgeable distance maintained by mutual, unspoken agreement. They were strangers, sharing a name, a house, a life that touched at the edges but never truly met. 2 months into her marriage, Amelia stood at her bedroom window, watching the sun set over the Whitmore estate, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. She had everything she had agreed to: security, status, a life free from financial worry. Her father's debts were settled. Her sister's future was secured. She had fulfilled her duty. But as the darkness crept across the landscape, she felt the weight of the silence pressing against her chest, heavy and relentless. She had saved her family by sacrificing herself, and the cost was proving far higher than she had imagined. Not because Julian was cruel. He was not. Not because he mistreated her. He was unfailingly courteous. But because living in the cold shadow of indifference was slowly draining the color from her world, leaving her in a perpetual twilight of loneliness. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and allowed herself one moment of weakness, one silent acknowledgement of the truth she kept buried during her waking hours. She was so terribly, achingly alone. The summons came on a morning in late July, delivered by Julian's valet with formal precision. His Grace requested the Duchess's presence in the library at her earliest convenience. Emilia set down her teacup, her heart performing an inexplicable flutter of anxiety. In the 10 weeks of their marriage, Julian had never requested a private audience. Their interactions remained confined to the ritualized civility of dinner and the occasional chance encounter in the corridors of the Abbey. She found him standing before the tall windows of the library, hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose of controlled authority. The morning light illuminated the room's treasures, thousands of leather-bound volumes rising to the vaulted ceiling, first editions and rare manuscripts collected by generations of Whitmores. It was the most beautiful room in the Abbey, and Emilia had spent countless hours here, finding solace among the books when the silence of her marriage became unbearable. "Your Grace," she said quietly, remaining near the doorway. "You wished to see me?" Julian turned, and for a moment something unreadable crossed his features. "Yes. Please, come in." He gestured to one of the leather chairs near the fireplace, waiting until she was seated before he spoke again. "I have observed that you spend considerable time in this room." Heat crept into Emilia's cheeks. Had he come to restrict her access? To inform her that she was neglecting some duty in favor of her books? "I apologize if I have been presumptuous, Your Grace. I did not mean to—" "You misunderstand me." His voice, though still formal, held a note she had not heard before. "I am not displeased. Quite the contrary." He moved to the desk and retrieved a small wooden box, which he placed on the table between them. "The library has been neglected since my mother's death. The cataloguing is incomplete, the acquisitions haphazard. Mrs. Dawson mentioned that you have been reorganizing certain sections." Emilia's hands twisted in her lap. She had indeed taken it upon herself to reorganize the poetry collection, and had begun a systematic review of the natural philosophy volumes. "I meant no offense, Your Grace. It was merely a way to occupy my time. If you prefer, I leave things as they are." "I prefer," Julian interrupted, opening the box to reveal a set of keys, "that you take full responsibility for the library's management. These are the keys to the rare books collection and the archive rooms. You will have complete authority over acquisitions, cataloguing, and any improvements you deem necessary. I will instruct my man of business to make funds available for the purpose." Emilia stared at him, unable to reconcile this unexpected gesture with the remote, indifferent man she had married. I don't know what to say." "A simple acceptance will suffice." There was the ghost of something in his eyes, amusement perhaps, or satisfaction. "You have a systematic mind, miss." He paused, correcting himself with what might have been the slightest hint of awkwardness. "Emilia, the library will benefit from your attention." It was the first time he had spoken her given name outside of their wedding vows. The sound of it in his deep, measured voice sent an odd tremor through her. "Thank you, Your Grace. I am grateful for your trust." "Julian." The word was quiet but distinct. She looked up sharply. "I beg your pardon?" "My name is Julian. We have been married for nearly 3 months. I believe we might dispense with excessive formality in private." He said it as if issuing a logical directive rather than extending an intimacy, but the effect was the same. The distance between them, so carefully maintained, had shifted by some small but perceptible degree. "Julian," she repeated softly, testing the shape of his name. "Thank you. He inclined his head, and she thought the conversation concluded. But he remained standing there, an unusual hesitation in his posture. "There is another matter," he said finally. "Your sister, Miss Cartwright. Catherine, I believe?" Amelia's breath caught. "Yes, she is 16. You write to her frequently. Mrs. Dawson mentioned that you have been quite concerned about her prospects, given your father's continued difficulties. That he knew about her correspondence, that he had noticed her worry, sent a shock of realization through her. How much had he observed? How closely had he been watching when she thought herself invisible to him? "Catherine is bright," Amelia said carefully. "Far cleverer than I ever was. She loves learning, languages, mathematics, but without a proper education or introduction to society." She trailed off, the familiar helplessness tightening her throat. "Then she should come here." Julian's tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the purchase of new livestock, rather than altering the composition of their household. "Whitmore Abbey is more than large enough to accommodate her. We can engage suitable tutors, a governess for the social graces, masters for languages and music. When the time comes, she will be introduced to society as the sister of a duchess. Her prospects will be significantly improved." Amelia could not speak. The generosity of the offer, the sheer unexpected kindness of it, overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. She pressed her fingers to her lips, fighting against the burn of tears. "I have upset you," Julian said, and for the first time, uncertainty entered his voice. "No." The word came out broken. "No, you have not. I am simply—" "I did not expect—" She drew a shaking breath, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "Why would you do this?" Something flickered across his face. Surprise at the question, perhaps, or discomfort at being asked to explain himself. "She is your sister. Your happiness, or at least your peace of mind, is not irrelevant to the smooth functioning of our household." It was a carefully neutral answer, the kind of practical justification she had come to expect from him. But Amelia heard what he did not say, saw what he tried to hide behind that wall of formality. He had noticed her letters, her worry, her loneliness. He had paid attention to her movements through his house, her hours in the library, the small ways she tried to make a life within the confines of their arrangement. Julian had been watching her, and what he had seen had moved him to action. "I would be deeply grateful," she said quietly. "Catherine's presence would mean a great deal to me." "Then it is settled. Write to her today. I will arrange for her transport within the fortnight." He moved toward the door, clearly eager to escape the unexpected emotion that had crept into the room. But he paused at the threshold, glancing back at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "I hope you will be more content here, Amelia. I would not wish you to be unhappy." He was gone before she could respond, leaving her alone in the library with the keys to his family's literary treasures and the first fragile tendril of hope she had felt since signing her name to their marriage contract. Julian Whittemore was not the cold, indifferent man she had believed him to be. He was watching her, noticing her, responding to needs she had never voiced. And that realization changed everything. Catherine's arrival at Whitmore Abbey had brought an unexpected lightness to the house. Her laughter echoed in the corridors. Her endless questions filled the silence at dinner, and for the first time since her wedding, Amelia felt something approaching happiness. Julian, to her surprise, tolerated Catherine's youthful exuberance with remarkable patience, even engaging her in discussions about Greek literature and the natural sciences with what Amelia suspected was genuine interest. For 3 precious weeks, Emilia allowed herself to believe that perhaps this quiet, careful existence could be enough. The illusion shattered on a humid August afternoon when Julian requested her presence in his study. The room was unmistakably his domain: dark wood, leather, and the faint scent of tobacco and ink. Emilia had been here only once before, on the day they signed their marriage contract. The memory made her stomach tighten as she entered to find Julian standing behind his desk, a letter in his hand and a tension in his jaw that she had not seen in weeks. "We must return to London," he said without preamble, "within the week." Emilia felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "I don't understand. The season is over. I thought we would remain at the Abbey until autumn." "As did I." Julian set down the letter with visible restraint. "However, it appears that our extended absence from town has generated precisely the sort of speculation I had hoped to avoid." He gestured to the correspondence scattered across his desk. "I have received 3 letters in as many days. My aunt, my solicitor, and this morning, the Duchess of Ashford herself." "What sort of speculation?" Emilia's voice came out smaller than she intended. Julian's expression hardened. "The predictable sort. That our marriage is a sham. That we cannot bear each other's company. That I have sequestered you in the country out of disappointment or shame, or that you have proven yourself unequal to the demands of your position." He paused, his grey eyes fixing on her with uncomfortable intensity. "There are also rumors regarding the financial circumstances of our union." The heat drained from Emilia's face. "They know? They suspect? Rumor and innuendo, nothing concrete. But London society thrives on such whispers, and left unaddressed, suspicion becomes accepted fact." He moved around the desk, his movements controlled but edged with frustration. "The Duchess of Ashford is hosting her annual charity ball in 3 weeks' time. It is one of the premier events of the late summer calendar. Our absence would be noted and interpreted as confirmation of the gossip. Our presence, particularly if we appear content in each other's company, will go far toward silencing the speculation." Emilia understood immediately what he was asking. They would have to perform their marriage for the ton's consumption, to play-act the roles of husband and wife with sufficient conviction to satisfy society's voracious appetite for propriety. The thought of it, the scrutiny, the judgment, the falseness, made her feel suddenly desperately tired. "I see," she managed. "Of course. I will prepare for the journey." "Emilia." The use of her name stopped her as she turned toward the door. "There is something else you must know. Something I should perhaps have told you before now." He hesitated, and she recognized the reluctance in his posture. Julian was a man who guarded his privacy fiercely. Whatever he was about to reveal cost him something to speak aloud. "Lady Beatrice Ashworth will certainly be in attendance at the ball," he said finally. "She is a prominent figure in society, well-connected, and possessed of considerable influence among the ton." "I have heard the name," Emilia said carefully. She had indeed. Catherine's governess, Mrs. Reed, had mentioned Lady Beatrice as one of the great beauties of recent seasons, a woman whose wit was as sharp as her ambition. "Lady Beatrice and I were acquainted before my marriage. She made her expectations regarding our future association quite clear." Julian's tone was clipped, clinical. "I did not reciprocate her interest. My subsequent engagement to you was, I believe, perceived as a personal slight." Understanding dawned, cold and unpleasant. "She wanted to be your Duchess. She wanted the title, the position, The power. Yes. Julian's jaw tightened. I have it on good authority that Lady Beatrice has been particularly active in spreading speculation about our marriage. She is clever, well-informed, and utterly ruthless when she perceives an advantage. You are warning me that she means me harm. I am telling you that the ton can be vicious, and Lady Beatrice is one of its most accomplished predators. She will smile at you, compliment you, and seek out every weakness, every vulnerability, every secret she can exploit. He stepped closer, and Amelia was struck by the intensity in his eyes. You must be on your guard at all times. Trust no confidences. Reveal nothing of a personal nature. Do not allow yourself to be drawn into private conversation with her or her associates. The protective edge in his voice surprised her. This was not mere concern for his own reputation. There was something almost personal in his warning, as if the threat to Amelia herself troubled him. I understand, she said quietly. I will be careful. The ton will judge you harshly simply for being my wife. They will scrutinize your every word, your every gesture, searching for evidence of inadequacy. Julian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You must understand, Amelia, that society's cruelty is not a reflection of your worth. It is merely their sport. And if they discover the truth, the real nature of our arrangement? The question escaped before she could stop it, voicing the fear that had haunted her since the day she signed her name to their contract. Something dangerous flickered in Julian's eyes. They will not. I will not permit it. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man accustomed to commanding reality to bend to his will. You are the Duchess of Whittemore. You have conducted yourself with grace and intelligence. You have managed my household, earned the respect of my staff, and fulfilled every obligation expected of you. No one will be permitted to diminish you, least of all a jealous, spiteful woman with delusions of her own consequence. The fierceness of his declaration left Amelia momentarily breathless. This was not the cold, indifferent man who had signed their marriage contract. This was someone else entirely. Someone who had noticed her efforts, valued her competence, and would defend her against the cruelty of his world. Thank you, she whispered, not trusting herself to say more. Julian inclined his head, the formal gesture at odds with the lingering intensity of the moment. We leave for London on Monday. Catherine may remain here with Mrs. Reed, or accompany us, if you prefer. I think she would be safer here, Amelia said, away from the gossip and speculation. As you wish. He returned to his desk, the conversation apparently concluded. But as Amelia reached the door, his voice stopped her once more. Amelia, you need not face them alone. Whatever happens in London, we face it together. You have my word. She looked back at him, this complicated, guarded man who had become her husband, and felt the fragile tendril of hope from the library scene bloom into something stronger, more dangerous. Trust. Whittemore House in London was grander than the Abbey, all gleaming marble and gilded elegance, but it felt even less like home. Amelia had been back in town for only 4 days when the invitation arrived for Lady Pemberton's evening reception, a relatively intimate gathering of 50 or so guests, designed to ease the most prominent members of the ton back into social circulation before the Ashford ball. Julian had accepted on their behalf without consulting her. It will serve as our reintroduction to society, he explained over breakfast, his tone matter-of-fact. A smaller venue, more controlled. An opportunity to establish our presence before the larger event. Amelia had nodded her agreement, though her stomach had twisted with apprehension. The performance was beginning. Lady Pemberton's drawing rooms were already crowded when they arrived, the air thick with expensive perfume, candle smoke, and the sharp undertone of competitive conversation. Amelia felt the weight of scrutiny the moment she entered on Julian's arm. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Fans snapped open to conceal whispering mouths. Eyes tracked their progress across the room with predatory interest. Julian's hand settled at the small of her back, a gesture of husbandly possession that looked entirely natural and felt utterly foreign. "Steady," he murmured, too low for anyone else to hear. "You look every inch a duchess." She clung to those words as they navigated the social gauntlet. Julian introduced her to a parade of aristocratic faces, dowagers who assessed her with cold calculation, gentlemen who bowed over her hand with practiced charm, ladies who smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. Amelia responded with careful grace, her manners flawless, her composure unwavering despite the growing certainty that every person in the room was measuring her against some invisible standard and finding her wanting. It was nearly an hour into the evening when Lady Beatrice made her entrance. Amelia noticed the shift in the room's attention before she saw the woman herself. Conversations redirected like iron filings drawn to a magnet. Julian's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against her back. A warning, perhaps, or merely acknowledgement of the inevitable. Lady Beatrice Ashworth was exquisite. There was no other word for it. She moved through the crowd with the effortless confidence of a woman who had never questioned her own supremacy. Her emerald silk gown cut to showcase a figure that would make sculptors weep. Her dark hair was arranged in artful curls that framed a face of classical perfection, high cheekbones, full lips, and eyes of a startling violet that sparkled with intelligence and something far less pleasant. Those eyes found Julian immediately, then slid to Amelia with the precision of a blade finding flesh. "Your Grace." Lady Beatrice's voice was honey and smoke as she approached, her smile radiant and utterly false. "How wonderful to see you return to London. We have all been quite concerned about your prolonged absence." "Lady Beatrice." Julian's tone was glacial. "May I present my wife, Amelia, Duchess of Whitmore?" "Amelia, Lady Beatrice Ashworth." "Your Grace." Beatrice executed a curtsy that managed to be technically perfect while somehow conveying mockery. "What a pleasure to finally meet you. We have all been so desperately curious about the woman who captured our dear Duke's attention so suddenly." The emphasis on the final word was delicate, almost imperceptible, but it landed like a slap. Amelia forced a gracious smile. "The pleasure is mine, Lady Beatrice. I have heard a great deal about you." "Have you indeed?" Beatrice's laugh was like crystal chiming. "How intriguing. Though I confess I had heard virtually nothing about you before your engagement was announced. You quite materialized out of nowhere, didn't you? Like a blessing dropped from the heavens precisely when our Duke found himself in need of, well, a duchess." Julian's jaw tightened. "If you'll excuse us, Lady Beatrice." "Oh, but I've only just begun to make the Duchess's acquaintance," Beatrice interrupted smoothly, her hand settling on Amelia's arm with false intimacy. "Surely you can spare her for just a moment, Your Grace. I'm certain you have other guests to attend to, and we ladies do so enjoy our private conversations." It was a test, Amelia realized. A challenge to see if Julian would abandon her or remain conspicuously protective. Either choice would feed the gossip. She met his eyes briefly, trying to convey that she could manage, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Julian hesitated, clearly torn, then inclined his head with visible reluctance. "I shall return shortly." The warning in his voice was directed at Beatrice, but she merely smiled serenely as he withdrew. The moment he was out of earshot, Beatrice's expression shifted. Still beautiful, still smiling, but with a sharpness that cut to the bone. "You must forgive my directness, Your Grace, but I feel it is my duty to be honest with you. The ton can be terribly unkind to those who, well, to those whose elevation is rather more circumstantial than earned." Amelia kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I'm sure I don't understand your meaning, Lady Beatrice." "Oh, I think you do." Beatrice's violet eyes glittered. "You see, we all know that the Duke required a wife of suitable breeding to secure his line. A practical matter, really. And when I heard that he had chosen the daughter of Lord Cartwright, a family facing such unfortunate financial difficulties, well, one couldn't help but admire the efficiency of the arrangement. The Duke acquires a biddable duchess of acceptable lineage, and the Cartwrights avoid the scandal of debtor's prison. Quite the elegant solution to two rather desperate problems." The blood drained from Amelia's face. How much did Beatrice actually know, and how much was calculated speculation designed to provoke a revealing reaction? "My marriage is a private matter, Lady Beatrice." "Of course it is, darling." "Of course it is." Beatrice's smile widened. "But nothing is truly private in London, is it? People talk, solicitors gossip with their clerks, servants exchange information, and the timing of your engagement so conveniently coinciding with your father's unfortunate reversal of fortune." She let the implication hang in the air, poisonous and damning. Amelia felt the walls closing in, the carefully constructed fiction of her marriage crumbling under Beatrice's surgical assault. I should find the Duke." "Running away so soon?" Beatrice's tone was all false sympathy. "My dear Duchess, you must develop a thicker skin if you intend to survive in our world. The ton will be far less gentle than I have been." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper that somehow felt like a shout. "A word of advice, from one woman to another. Being chosen out of necessity is not the same as being wanted. The Duke required a transaction, not a love match. The sooner you accept that your value to him is purely functional, the less disappointed you'll be when he seeks warmer companionship elsewhere." The cruelty of it stole Amelia's breath. She stood frozen, unable to formulate a response, unable to defend herself against accusations that were fundamentally, devastatingly accurate. She was a transaction, a practical solution, a duchess purchased to solve a problem. "Ah, there you are, my dear." Lady Pemberton's voice cut through the moment like salvation. "You simply must come meet the Countess of Bexley. She's been asking about you." Amelia seized the escape, murmuring some inadequate farewell to Beatrice and allowing herself to be swept away. But as she moved through the crowded room, smiling mechanically and making appropriate responses to conversation she barely heard, she felt Beatrice's gaze following her like a predator tracking wounded prey. The message had been delivered with devastating clarity. Lady Beatrice knew the truth, or enough of it to destroy her. And worse, everything she had said was simply an articulation of Amelia's own deepest fears. That she was nothing more than a convenient solution to Julian's dynastic requirements. That her worth was measured solely in her utility. That she would never be truly wanted for herself. When Julian finally found her an hour later, his eyes searched her face with sharp concern. "What did she say to you?" "Nothing of consequence," Amelia lied, the words tasting like ash. "Simply the usual pleasantries." But Julian's expression suggested he knew better, and the tight control in his features told her that the battle lines had been irrevocably drawn. Amelia found refuge in Lady Pemberton's conservatory, a glass-enclosed sanctuary at the far end of the house where the sounds of the party faded to a distant murmur. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth, the greenery offering a welcome shield from the relentless scrutiny of the drawing rooms. She pressed her fingers against the cool glass, watching the rain that had begun to fall against the panes, and tried to steady her breathing. Beatrice's words circled in her mind like carrion birds. Being chosen out of necessity is not the same as being wanted. The truth of it was unbearable, made worse because Amelia had believed she had reconciled herself to the reality of her marriage. She had thought herself prepared for a life of cordial distance, of duty without affection. But somehow, in the weeks at the Abbey, with the library keys and Catherine's arrival and Julian's small, careful gestures, she had allowed herself to hope for something more. What a fool she had been. I wondered where you had disappeared to. Amelia spun around to find Julian silhouetted in the doorway, his tall frame backlit by the corridor's lamplight. She quickly turned away, swiping at her eyes, mortified that he should find her like this, hiding, vulnerable, on the verge of tears. I needed some air, she managed, trying to inject normalcy into her voice. The rooms were rather warm. Amelia. The single word carried a weight that made it impossible to maintain the pretense. He stepped into the conservatory, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt oddly intimate. What did Lady Beatrice say to you? I told you. Nothing of consequence. And I know you are lying. He moved closer, and she heard the controlled frustration in his voice. I saw your face when Lady Pemberton extracted you from that conversation. I have been watching you for the past hour, watching you smile and converse and play your part perfectly while looking as though you might shatter at any moment. So I ask you again, what did she say? The careful concern in his voice, so at odds with the formal distance they usually maintained, finally broke through her composure. She knows, Amelia whispered. Or suspects, about the financial arrangement, about my father's debts and the timing of our marriage. She all but stated that you purchased me out of necessity, that I am nothing more than a functional solution to your need for a suitable duchess. She heard Julian's sharp intake of breath, felt the fury radiating from him like heat from a forge. That venomous, calculating. He bit off the words, clearly struggling for control. Beatrice deals in innuendo and half-truths. She manipulates perception to serve her own ends. Whatever she implied, whatever she suggested. She said nothing that wasn't true. Amelia turned to face him, her composure crumbling. That is what makes it so unbearable. She simply articulated what I already know, what I agreed to when I signed that contract. I am a transaction, a practical choice. Chosen for my breeding and my desperation, not for any quality of my own. Stop. Julian's command was sharp, almost harsh. He closed the remaining distance between them, his grey eyes blazing with an intensity she had never seen before. You will not allow Beatrice Ashworth to define the terms of our marriage or your worth within it. Then perhaps you should define them, Julian, because I no longer know what we are to each other. The words burst from her with surprising force. You give me the library and bring Catherine to the Abbey and warn me about the cruelty of the ton as if I matter to you beyond my utility as a duchess. But you never speak to me of anything real. You never tell me what you think or feel or want. You maintain this perfect, impenetrable reserve, and I am left to interpret your gestures like some desperate supplicant searching for scraps of regard. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rain against glass. Julian stood frozen, his expression cycling through shock, something that might have been pain, and finally a kind of resigned exhaustion. You want truth, he said quietly. Very well. I despise Lady Beatrice Ashworth because she represents everything I find contemptible about our world. She is beautiful, accomplished, impeccably connected, and utterly hollow. Every word she speaks is calculated for effect. Every gesture serves an agenda. She pursued me with the single-minded determination of a general laying siege. and she never once demonstrated the slightest interest in who I actually am beyond the title I carry. He moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked garden. When I decided to marry, I resolved to choose someone whose character I could respect, even if affection was unlikely. I interviewed half a dozen suitable candidates. They simpered and flattered and performed their breeding like thoroughbreds at auction. It was nauseating. He glanced back at her, and something vulnerable flickered in his eyes. And then I met you. Amelia's breath caught. Julian. You were the only one who did not pretend. His voice was raw now, stripped of its usual careful control. When I laid out the terms of our arrangement, you did not weep or swoon or claim you would learn to love me despite the circumstances. You looked me in the eye and accepted the reality of what I was offering. No false sentiment, no theatrical displays, just dignity and honesty. He turned fully toward her, and she saw something she had never expected to see in the Duke of Whitmore's face. Uncertainty. I chose you because you were real, Amelia. In a world built on pretense and performance, you were the only genuine thing I could find. The confession hung between them, more intimate than any physical touch. Amelia felt tears spilling down her cheeks, unable to stop them. But you never said, you never indicated that you saw me as anything more than a suitable choice. I know. Julian's expression twisted with something like regret. I am not practiced in expressing sentiment. I was raised to view emotion as weakness, to maintain control at all costs. I thought if I simply demonstrated my regard through actions, the library, Catherine, defending you against gossip, you would understand without requiring me to articulate what I barely understand myself. What do you understand? Amelia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian held her gaze, and for the first time since their wedding, she saw the man behind the ducal mask, complicated, uncertain, struggling against the constraints of his own upbringing. That this marriage has become something I did not anticipate. That somewhere between the contract signing and this moment, you stopped being simply a solution to a problem and became someone I do not wish to fail. Someone whose happiness matters to me in ways I did not agree to and cannot quite control. It was not a declaration of love. It was awkward and incomplete and hedged with Julian's characteristic caution. But it was honest, vulnerably and painfully honest, and it meant more to Amelia than any flowery protestation could have. Beatrice wants to destroy me, she said quietly. She will use the truth of our arrangement to humiliate me, to diminish me in society's eyes. Then we will not allow her that satisfaction. Julian's voice regained some of its commanding certainty. At the Ashford ball, we will present a united front, and if Beatrice attempts to expose you, she will discover that attacking my Duchess is the gravest miscalculation she has ever made. My Duchess. The possessive pronoun sent warmth cascading through Amelia's chest. She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension in his jaw. I do not know how to navigate your world, Julian. I am terrified of failing you. You could not. His hand rose, hesitated, then gently brushed a tear from her cheek, the first tender touch he had ever offered her. You have more courage and grace than anyone I have ever known. Beatrice is right to fear you. In the hushed sanctuary of the conservatory, with rain falling and truth finally spoken between them, Amelia saw her husband clearly for the first time. Not the cold, controlled Duke, but a man struggling against his own emotional constraints, trying in his halting way to offer her what he had never learned to give. It was not everything. But it was a beginning. The Duchess of Ashford's charity ball was everything the ton promised it would be. a glittering spectacle of wealth, power, and ruthless social hierarchy. The Ashford mansion blazed with thousands of candles, their light refracting through crystal chandeliers and gilding the assembled aristocracy in a warm, deceptive glow. The ballroom itself was a masterpiece of excess. Marble columns wrapped in cream silk and hothouse roses, an orchestra positioned in the gallery above, and enough champagne flowing to float a small vessel. Amelia felt Julian's arm beneath her gloved hand as they ascended the grand staircase, announced to the assembled guests by a footman, whose voice carried across the sudden hush that fell over the room. "His Grace the Duke of Whittemore, and Her Grace the Duchess of Whittemore." Every eye turned toward them. Amelia felt the weight of their collective scrutiny, like a physical pressure against her skin. She kept her spine straight, her expression serene, channeling every lesson in deportment she had ever learned. Her gown, a creation of midnight blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes, had been chosen specifically for this moment, designed to project confidence and ducal authority. Julian had insisted on the sapphires at her throat, his family's jewels making a clear statement of her position and his claim. "Breathe," Julian murmured, his lips barely moving. "You look magnificent." She clung to those words as they descended into the glittering crowd. The Duchess of Ashford, a formidable woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and sharper judgment, greeted them with practiced warmth that didn't quite reach her calculating gaze. "Your Graces, how delightful that you could join us. We have all been so eager to see you both together. Such a charming couple." The emphasis on "together" was subtle but unmistakable. The Ton had noticed their separation, had drawn conclusions, and was now reassessing in light of their public appearance. Amelia smiled graciously and said all the right things, but she could feel the undercurrent of speculation swirling around them like a dangerous tide. Julian guided her through the crowd with protective propriety, his hand never leaving the small of her back. They danced the opening waltz together, and Amelia was acutely conscious of how they must appear. The reserved Duke and his elegant Duchess, moving in perfect synchronization, the very picture of aristocratic harmony. If only they knew how her heart hammered against her ribs, how Julian's hand at her waist felt both anchoring and terrifying. "You are doing beautifully," he said quietly as they turned. "They can find no fault in you. But they would try." Amelia saw it in the faces that watched them. Curiosity, envy, and in some cases, barely concealed hostility. The whispers began the moment the waltz ended, and Julian was obliged to dance with their hostess. Left to navigate the social waters alone, Amelia was immediately surrounded by a group of ladies whose smiles were as sharp as cut glass. "Such a lovely gown, Your Grace," Lady Thornbury cooed. "Though I confess, I had imagined you would favor something more vibrant for such an occasion, but perhaps you prefer a more subdued palette." The implication that Amelia lacked confidence or social understanding was delicately delivered. Amelia responded with cool politeness, but each conversation felt like a skirmish, every compliment concealing a barb. She caught sight of Lady Beatrice across the room, resplendent in emerald green, holding court among a circle of admirers. Their eyes met briefly, and Beatrice's smile was a promise of violence to come. By the time the supper interval arrived, Amelia's composure was wearing dangerously thin. She excused herself from yet another conversation about the unexpected nature of her marriage and sought refuge in the relative quiet of the ladies' retiring room. But as she approached down a less traveled corridor, she heard voices from an alcove just ahead, voices that made her freeze in her tracks. "Absolutely certain?" The speaker was Lady Fairfax, a notorious gossip whose influence extended across half of London society. "Completely." Beatrice's honeyed tones were unmistakable. "I have it on excellent authority, the exact figure of Lord Cartwright's debts, down to the last pound. The Duke paid them all, of course, in exchange for the acquisition of a suitably bred wife. Really, it's quite the mercenary arrangement when one examines the details." Amelia's blood turned to ice. "And you intend to reveal this tonight?" Lady Fairfax sounded both scandalized and thrilled. "Here, in front of everyone? Why not? The truth should not be hidden, should it? The ton deserves to know that their esteemed Duke of Whittemore purchased his Duchess like one might purchase a prize mare, paying off her family's shameful debts in exchange for her bloodline and her obedience." Beatrice's laugh was soft and vicious. "I shall be doing everyone a service, really, exposing the pretense before it causes further confusion about what their marriage actually is. But the scandal will attach primarily to her, not him. Society will forgive a duke almost anything, particularly when he was simply making a practical decision. But a woman who sold herself to save her family from ruin, who has been masquerading as a proper duchess while being nothing more than a purchased solution, another cruel laugh. She will be destroyed. And Julian will finally understand what it means to choose poorly. When will you do it? After the charity auction, when everyone is gathered and the champagne has loosened tongues. I shall simply inquire, very publicly, very innocently, about the generous settlement the Duke made to Lord Cartwright. Let others draw the obvious conclusions. By the time the truth spreads through the ballroom, she will be thoroughly ruined." Amelia pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting against the wave of nausea that threatened to overwhelm her. Beatrice had proof, actual figures, actual details. This was not innuendo or speculation. This was complete, devastating exposure of the one secret that could reduce her from Duchess to object of pity and scorn. She forced herself to move, to slip past the alcove undetected and continue to the retiring room on trembling legs. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman who looked composed, elegant, every inch a duchess. Only she could see the terror in her own eyes. The auction would conclude within the hour. She had perhaps 90 minutes before Beatrice executed her plan and destroyed everything. Amelia's dignity, her position, the fragile understanding she and Julian had only just begun to build. She could leave now, feign illness, and retreat to Whitmore House, but that would only confirm the gossip, would make her look weak and guilty. She could warn Julian, but what could he do? The truth was the truth. There was no defense against it, no clever argument that could transform a transaction into a love match. Amelia stared at her reflection, at the sapphires glittering at her throat, Julian's family jewels, his public claim of her status. She thought of his words in the conservatory, his halting confession that she had become someone whose happiness mattered to him. She thought of the library keys, of Catherine laughing at the Abbey, of small gestures that suggested she meant something beyond mere utility. And she thought of Lady Beatrice's calculating smile, her determination to destroy what Amelia and Julian had barely begun to create. She would not run. She would not hide. If she was to be exposed and humiliated before all of London society, she would face it with the same dignity that had prompted Julian to choose her in the first place. But as she returned to the ballroom, her heart heavy with dread, she could not shake the feeling that she was walking toward her own execution, and there was nothing anyone could do to save her. The charity auction concluded to enthusiastic applause, the final sum announced with great fanfare by the Duchess of Ashford herself. Amelia stood near one of the marble columns, Julian having been pulled away moments earlier by Lord Melbourne to discuss some urgent parliamentary matter. She watched him across the room, his tall frame bent slightly to hear the elderly statesman, and felt a desperate urge to reach for him, to anchor herself before the coming storm. "Your Grace," Beatrice's voice came from behind her, smooth as poisoned honey. "How fortuitous to find you alone. I have been hoping for a chance to speak with you more privately." Amelia turned slowly, her heart sinking as she realized that Beatrice was not alone. Lady Fairfax stood beside her, along with Mrs. Rothwell and the Viscountess Pemberton, three of the most influential gossips in London society, and around them, as if drawn by invisible strings, other guests were beginning to gather, conversations trailing off as they sensed something significant about to unfold. "Lady Beatrice," Amelia managed, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "I was just telling Lady Fairfax about your dear father," Beatrice continued, her voice carrying clearly across the increasingly attentive crowd. "Lord Cartwright. Such unfortunate circumstances he faced this past year. Though I understand his situation has improved dramatically since your marriage." The trap was sprung. Amelia could see no escape, no graceful way to extricate herself without appearing evasive. "My father's affairs are private, Lady Beatrice. Of course, but surely there is no shame in acknowledging the Duke's extraordinary generosity." Beatrice's smile was radiant and terrible. "After all, it is quite admirable how His Grace came to your family's rescue. £50,000, was it not? To settle Lord Cartwright's gambling debts and prevent the estate from falling into the hands of creditors?" The figure hung in the air like a blade. Amelia heard the sharp intake of breath from a dozen throats, saw the understanding dawning on faces all around her. £50,000. An enormous sum, a fortune that could only mean one thing. "I believe you are mistaken about the particulars," Amelia said, but her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Am I?" Beatrice's eyes glittered with triumph. "How strange. I was quite certain of my information. After all, such transactions do leave paper trails, and solicitors' clerks can be remarkably forthcoming when properly motivated." She turned to address the growing crowd, her voice projecting perfectly. "It is really quite a romantic story when one thinks about it. A gentleman in desperate financial straits, a daughter of suitable breeding but no prospects, and a duke in need of a wife to secure his line. Why, it is practically a fairy tale. The impoverished beauty rescued by the wealthy aristocrat, all debts settled in exchange for a marriage contract. Lady Beatrice, that is quite enough." Amelia's hands were shaking now, her composure fracturing under the weight of public exposure. "Is it, though?" Beatrice stepped closer, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried even further. "Tell me, Your Grace, does it trouble you to know that everyone here now understands the precise financial value your husband placed on acquiring you? £50,000 for a duchess. Really quite reasonable when one considers the alternative was debtor's prison for your entire family." The humiliation crashed over Amelia like a physical wave. Around her, the assembled guests stared with expressions ranging from shock to pity to barely concealed satisfaction. She had been reduced, in front of London's entire elite society, to nothing more than a commodity, a purchased bride, a desperate transaction dressed up in silk and sapphires. "You are cruel," Amelia whispered, tears burning behind her eyes. "I am honest," Beatrice corrected. "Something you and your husband have notably failed to be with." "You will be silent." Julian's voice cut across the ballroom like a whip-crack, cold and absolute with aristocratic fury. The crowd parted instantly as he strode forward, his grey eyes blazing with an rage that made even Beatrice take an involuntary step backward. He moved directly to Amelia, positioning himself between her and Beatrice with protective deliberation. "You dare," he said, each word edged with ice and violence barely contained, "to attack my wife in public, to reduce her to the subject of your venomous gossip." "I merely spoke the truth, Your Grace," Beatrice said, though her voice had lost some of its confidence. "Surely you cannot fault me for—" "The truth?" Julian's laugh was without humor. You know nothing of truth, Lady Beatrice. You deal in innuendo and manipulation, twisting facts to serve your own bitter jealousy." He turned to address the entire assembled crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "Yes, I paid Lord Cartwright's debts. Yes, the marriage was arranged. But if you believe that reduces my wife's worth, then you understand nothing." He turned back to Amelia, and she saw something fierce and possessive burning in his eyes, something that stole her breath and made her heart race for entirely different reasons than fear. "I chose Amelia Cartwright," Julian said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. "Not because I needed any duchess, but because I needed her. Because in a world of performance and pretense, she was the only genuine soul I could find. Because she faced desperate circumstances with dignity and courage that puts every person in this room to shame. Because she has managed my household with grace, earned the devotion of my staff, and fulfilled every obligation with a competence that far exceeds anything I had right to expect." His hand reached for hers, and Amelia felt his fingers close around her trembling ones. Warm, strong, anchoring. She could have wept, she could have begged, she could have played the victim and extracted sympathy in softer terms. Julian's eyes never left Amelia's face. Instead, she looked me in the eye and accepted reality with unflinching honesty. "That is why I chose her. That is why she is my duchess. Not because I purchased her, but because she is worth far more than any sum I could possibly pay." And then, before the entire shocked assembly of London society, before the Duchess of Ashford and Lady Beatrice and every gossip and aristocrat in attendance, Julian Whittemore pulled his wife into his arms and kissed her. It was not the cold, formal kiss of their wedding. This was possession and declaration, fierce and tender and utterly inappropriate for public consumption. His hand cupped her face, his other arm encircling her waist, pulling her against him with a passion that declared to everyone watching that this was not a marriage of mere convenience. Amelia gasped against his lips, shock giving way to something molten and overwhelming. She felt his heart pounding against her chest, felt the tremor in his hands that betrayed how much this cost him. This public display from a man who had built his entire life on emotional control. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "You are mine," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Not because I bought you, but because I choose you, today, tomorrow, and every day hence, and anyone who suggests otherwise will answer to me." The ballroom had gone utterly silent, hundreds of witnesses frozen in shock. Then, slowly, someone began to applaud. Lord Melbourne. His weathered face creased in approval. Others joined, hesitantly at first, then with growing enthusiasm. The social calculus was recalculating in real time. The Duke had claimed his Duchess publicly, passionately. Whatever the circumstances of their marriage, he had just declared it genuine. Beatrice stood pale and trembling, her triumph turned to ashes. She had exposed the transaction, but Julian had transformed it into something else entirely. A love story born from pragmatism, a genuine connection forged in unlikely circumstances. Julian offered Amelia his arm, his expression daring anyone to comment. "We are leaving," he announced. "My wife has endured quite enough of society's judgment for one evening." And as they walked through the parted crowd toward the exit, Amelia felt the weight of humiliation lifting, replaced by something fragile and precious and utterly unexpected. Hope. The carriage door closed behind them with a decisive click, sealing them into the private darkness of the Whitmore coach. The sounds of the ball faded as the horses pulled away from the Ashford mansion, leaving behind the shocked whispers and recalculating gazes of London society. Emilia sat rigidly on the velvet seat, her hands clasped in her lap, her entire body trembling with the aftermath of what had just transpired. Julian sat across from her, his face shadowed but his tension palpable. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and the memory of that devastating public kiss. "What was that?" Emilia's voice emerged sharper than she intended, breaking under the weight of confusion and desperate hope. "What you did in there, what you said. I need to understand what it meant." Julian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his grey eyes finding hers in the dim light filtering through the carriage windows. "What do you think it meant?" "I don't know." The words burst from her with surprising force. "I don't know if it was theatre for their benefit, another performance to salvage our reputations, or if it was." She couldn't finish, couldn't voice the fragile possibility that it might have been real. "Do you truly believe," Julian said quietly, "that I would kiss you like that merely for appearance's sake?" "I don't know what to believe anymore." Emilia pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the evening's emotional violence. "You have spent months maintaining perfect distance, treating our marriage as exactly what it was, a transaction. And then tonight you claimed me in front of everyone. You spoke of choosing me, of my worth, as if I actually matter to you beyond my utility as a duchess. You do matter." Julian's voice was rough, strained with emotion he was clearly struggling to control. "God help me, Emilia. You matter far more than I ever intended you to." She looked up sharply, her breath catching. "What are you saying?" Julian ran a hand through his hair, destroying its careful arrangement, a gesture of frustration she had never seen from him. "I am saying that I have made a spectacular mess of this marriage by trying to maintain control over something that cannot be controlled. I told myself that ours would be a practical arrangement, that I would fulfill my obligations and maintain appropriate distance, that I would not allow myself to become entangled in emotions I did not understand and could not manage." "And?" Emilia prompted, her heart hammering. "And I failed completely." He leaned back against the seat, his expression almost helpless. "It began the day you signed the contract. You sat in your father's library, knowing exactly what you were agreeing to, and you accepted the terms without tears or theatrics. Just quiet dignity and unflinching honesty. I admired you for it, though I told myself admiration was not the same as attachment." He paused, and Emilia waited, barely breathing, terrified that if she spoke, she would shatter this moment of revelation. "Then you came to Whittemore Abbey," Julian continued, his voice growing softer. "And you did not complain about the isolation or the separate apartments or the coldness of our arrangement. You simply lived, with grace and competence, and a quiet strength that I found myself watching, studying, drawn to, despite my best efforts to remain detached." "You were watching me," Emilia whispered, remembering the fleeting glances, the moments she had caught him observing her. Constantly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I noticed how you spoke to the servants, with genuine kindness, not the condescending politeness most aristocrats employ. I noticed how you transformed the library from a neglected collection into a living, breathing sanctuary. I noticed your letters to Catherine, the worry you tried to hide, the love you have for your family, despite how they failed you." His hand reached across the space between them, palm up, an offering. Emilia stared at it for a heartbeat, then placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and certain. "I thought if I gave you the library, if I brought Catherine to the Abbey, if I defended you against society's cruelty, you would understand what I could not say aloud. That you had become essential to me. That somewhere in the weeks of our marriage, You stopped being a transaction and became Emilia, my wife. The woman I thought about constantly, worried for, wanted to protect and please, and... He broke off, the words clearly difficult. "And what?" Emilia prompted, tears streaming down her face. "And love," Julian finished, the word sounding almost bewildered coming from his lips. "I have fallen in love with my own wife, which should not be remarkable except that I never planned for it, never wanted it, and now cannot imagine existing without it." Emilia made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "You love me?" Desperately, inconveniently, completely. Julian pulled her across the carriage onto the seat beside him, his hands framing her face with infinite tenderness. "That kiss tonight was not for them, Emilia. It was not performance or strategy. It was my heart finally overriding my head, my need to claim you, truly claim you, overwhelming every rule of propriety and emotional restraint I have ever been taught." "Julian," she breathed, his name a prayer and a promise. "I am asking," he continued, his thumb brushing away her tears, "if you might consider allowing this marriage to become something real. Not a contract, but a partnership. Not duty, but choice. I know I have given you little reason to trust in my affections, that I have been distant and controlled and utterly inadequate at expressing—" Emilia silenced him by pulling his mouth to hers. This kiss was different from the one at the ball. Softer, deeper, achingly tender. It tasted of tears and truth and the beginning of something precious. Julian made a low sound of surrender, his arms wrapping around her and pulling her against him as if he could anchor her to him through sheer force of will. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Emilia rested her forehead against his. "I have been so afraid," she whispered, "afraid that I would never be more than a purchase solution. That you would never see me as anything beyond a means to an heir and social respectability." "I see you," Julian said fiercely. "I see your courage and intelligence and grace. I see the woman who accepted impossible terms with dignity, who transformed my house into a home, who faces the ton's cruelty without flinching. I see you, Emilia, and I choose you. Not because of any contract, but because my heart allows no other choice." She kissed him again, pouring into it all the loneliness and hope and desperate love that had been building in her since that first brush of fingers over a marriage contract. Julian responded with a passion that spoke of months of restraint finally breaking, of control surrendered in favor of genuine connection. When the carriage finally pulled up to Whitmore House, they were wrapped in each other's arms, Emilia's head resting against Julian's chest as his fingers traced idle patterns on her back. The future stretched before them, no longer cold and transactional, but warm with possibility. "Take me upstairs," Emilia whispered against his throat. "Not to my apartments. To yours. To ours." Julian's arms tightened around her, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion and promise. "Tonight and every night. You are mine, Emilia Whitmore, and I am irrevocably, completely yours." They entered their home not as Duke and Duchess bound by contract, but as husband and wife, bound by something far more powerful, a love born from pragmatism, tested by society's cruelty, and tempered into something genuine and lasting. The transaction had become a love story, and it was only just beginning. The end. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you would love to see part 2, do let me know in the comment section, and if you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazy and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image on your screen to watch the next one. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.